All right, thanks, BB. Thanks, Pierrette, and thank you all for coming today and having us here, and thank you for IPPSR for putting this together. My name is Frederick. I'm the Vice President of Community Affairs for Connected Nation and Connect Michigan. So just a little bit about Connected Nation and Connect Michigan. We are a nonprofit organization, and our basic goal is to expand quality of life and community and economic development opportunities through the expansion of broadband access, adoption, and use. We've been in the state of Michigan since 2009. We've been partnered with the Michigan Public Service Commission and other state agencies since then to work on mapping broadband availability. We've been doing research. We've been doing a lot of on-the-ground community planning when it comes to broadband in Michigan. And we've worked with 54 of Michigan's 83 counties on the ground in this capacity to really help expand the education and build capacity for broadband. So we're not a broadband provider, but we play in a strange space between public and private to really raise the boat on both sides for a better Michigan and a better digital economy in the state. So I mentioned the three words before: access, adoption, and use. So we look at broadband not just as the infrastructure, but how are folks adopting it, which we addressed a lot of, and then of course how they're using it. So the access part of it can be thought of as the supply and adoption use as the demand. So we can't just look at infrastructure and take the build it and they will come model. We have to address all sides of this equation in order to again, improve Michigan's standing in a digital economy. So why does it matter? There's been a lot of talk today about why broadband matters, and I want to share a few of our perspectives as well to add to this body of knowledge about why the internet is important for Michigan communities, institutions, residents, and businesses. Between 2001 and 2010 in rural counties, this is a national study, where broadband adoption was high, so above 60% of households had subscribed to internet service, we found that income grew faster and unemployment grew slower. In that same period, in rural communities where broadband adoption was low, again, less than 40% of households subscribed to internet service. They lost more businesses during that time frame and lost more jobs. Obviously, there was an economic recession during that time, but it appears that rural counties that had higher broadband adoption were able to weather that economic recession a little bit better. From some of our research here in Michigan, we find that small businesses that have a social media presence and use it at a weekly basis are 3 times more likely to have recently hired and hired for more positions than businesses who don't use social media at all. We found similarly that small businesses with websites have higher annual revenues and are more likely to have recently hired than those without websites. Now, this isn't businesses with and without an internet connection. It's those that are leveraging that connection to sustain and grow themselves and improve their place in a digital economy. We find that residents in Michigan who telework typically have, or who do not telework, have incomes that are 75% of that of residents who telework with any sort of frequency. And we see that as digital literacy among the residents increases in our community, so too does the digital interaction between those residents and their local government, their state government, local businesses, and all the other entities that make up our communities. So when we improve digital literacy, we improve that digital and social interaction in an online environment. So where do we stand in Michigan? That's really what I want to talk about today, is where do we stand as a state? So like I said, we've been mapping and researching broadband in Michigan since 2009, and we've tracked the availability of broadband at a few different speeds. So when we started mapping broadband in Michigan, the basic definition was 768 kilobytes per second. Now, if somebody in this room has a connection that slow, it's barely better than dial-up now. And we've seen that the ever-steady increase in that definition of broadband from a speed perspective. We've seen it go from 768 kilobytes to 4 megabytes per second to 10 megabytes per second, and now the FCC's definition of advanced broadband at 25 megabytes per second down the download side of things. So this chart shows 3 different speeds in Michigan at 2 different geographies. One is the 3 megabyte per second speed tier, which is a okay speed if you don't have anything else. The solid lines represent growth at that speed tier for the entire state, and the dashed line represent those in rural parts of the state, so those areas that are designated rural by the census. The red line represents 10 megabytes per second. Again, solid line is the state level. The dashed line is the rural parts of the state. And this line here, you know you can't tell the difference between blue and gray with the lights on here, but this is 25 megabytes per second. So this is the statewide household availability at 25 megabytes per second. This is the rural availability. Now, if you're wondering why there was a big dip here, we had a provider that went out of business that served a lot of rural counties during this time frame. So that's why there's a pretty big dip in between 2014 and 2015. But you can see that rural areas definitely have not kept up with the state as a whole when we're talking about expansion. Now, I have down in here that this chart paints a fairly rosy picture of household availability in the state. But if we look at some of these same data points from a geographic perspective, the impact is very apparent. So anything red, orange, yellow, if you're colorblind like me, it all kind of looks like one shade. On these maps show areas that are unserved at these various speed tiers. So the map on your left is at 10 megabytes per second. So again, anything in yellow, orange, burnt sienna, whatever you want to call it. On this map are household density that don't have access to that speed. And on this side are those areas that don't have access to that 25 megabyte per second speed tier. So while the numbers paint a rosy picture, and you can imagine that this is because of household density and availability in many of our urban and suburban areas and small towns even, when we get outside those areas, that availability falls off. We can do the same thing and look at the density of broadband providers. So here we're looking at competition. So on the left side here, we're seeing provider density at 10 megabytes per second. So the darker the color on this map, the more providers there are offering speeds of at least 10 megabytes per second. When you jump to that higher speed tier at 25 megabytes per second, a lot of those darker colors fade away, simply because there's not as many providers offering those levels of speed to residents outside of our urban and suburban and small town areas. So this paints a picture of where we are for Michigan. Again, the numbers paint a rosy picture, but when we start looking at areas of the state, on this map in particular, this one here, the 25 meg speed tier, that's where we really have our work cut out for us. So what's being done about infrastructure? I debated how to put these slides in order, but I thought it'd be important here to talk about infrastructure since we're looking at maps. So the FCC currently has a program called the Connect America Fund. And it's a subsidy program that is providing funding to various internet service providers across the country and in Michigan here to expand 10 megabyte per second internet into rural areas. So this table up here at the top shows the total number of households that are going to be connected under this one part of the Connect America Fund. So 207,000 households. And this is the total subsidy coming to the state of Michigan, $381 million. And it's going to AT&T, Frontier, CenturyLink, and then a handful of smaller rate of return carriers in the state. So there's a lot of places that are getting new internet service. I live in one of the census blocks that was eligible for this funding, and I know that I have new AT&T service available to me now. So it's being done, it's being built out. However, these two maps show areas of the state that will still be unserved at these two various speed tiers after all of this money is spent. So it doesn't solve all of the problem. And it certainly doesn't get all of us to this 25 megabyte per second speed tier, again, that the FCC uses to define advanced broadband service. So again, we still have our work cut out for us, even though there is a lot of subsidy and money flowing to internet service providers. So let's talk about adoption. And BB did a great job of summarizing the adoption issues in the state of Michigan. This is pulled from the census and shows broadband adoption from 2013 through 2016. But this breaks it up a little bit differently. So the red on this chart shows fixed broadband connectivity. So these are the households that actually have a fixed line coming to their house or have a fixed wireless signal. So this includes cable, DSL, fiber to the home, and fixed wireless technologies designed for stationary use. So about 65% of households have that type of connection. 21% though connect to the internet in some other way. And we at Connect Michigan don't really feel these are sustainable models for connecting to the internet. So this would include satellite, a mobile only or a hotspot type connection, some other type of connection like leeching your neighbor's Wi-Fi is a good example of that as well, or some other connection that again, people are using to get online, but it's not a fixed connection that provides them that permanent, more reliable connection to the internet. So we can see that adoption of those connection types have been pretty stagnant over the last 4 years or so. This is particularly true with low-income households. So I know, BB, you've done a lot of research on this area. But again, this shows the trend by household income. So the bar down here, this is 43.7% of households that make less than $10,000 a year are online, or are offline, I'm sorry. And you can see that this digital divide by income is quite apparent. Of course, this has to do with affordability of those connections. Being aware of programs that are available for low-income households to make broadband more affordable is a key part of this, and making sure that those households can take advantage of it to gain all the benefits that an internet connection can bring. When it comes to cost in Michigan, I threw a few numbers on here. This will be available after the show today on IPPSR's website, I'm sure. To kind of compare cost in Michigan. So when we look at cost very quickly, we find that in Michigan, it costs about $4 for a per download megabyte for your connection. And again, if you're a slower connection, this cost is going to go up. If you have a higher connection, that this per megabyte connection goes down, but cost goes down. But it gives us some idea of how to compare ourselves to other states. Across the country, this cost is about $5.16. In Michigan, it's $4.12. Some of our other neighbors are a little bit lower. So Ohio, Wisconsin, and Illinois are in the $3.50, high $2 range for megabyte per second. And then Indiana pays a lot of money per download megabyte at almost $11. So Michigan's costs aren't exorbitant, but there are definitely households that struggle with that, as we can see by the chart. So what are we doing about it? Where should we be as a state? Back in late 2016, the Governor's 21st Century Infrastructure Commission released a report that outlined some pretty aggressive goals for where we need to be as a state. So for example, by the end of 2020, every resident and business should have access to that 25 megabytes per second speed tier. And by the end of 2024, that connection should be at least 100 megabytes per second on the download side. When we look at adoption, which there are goals set for adoption, which is unusual for a state broadband plan, they're looking to have 95% of residents have adopted a fixed broadband connection by 2024, and that fixed part is what I was talking about earlier. And 95% of businesses having a web presence by 2020, because we believe it or not, we still have businesses that aren't online. So these are some pretty aggressive goals that will take some bold action to achieve. So what are the barriers preventing us from achieving these goals as a state? And many of them were discussed, especially by Pierrette and BB2, but looking at low density of household, again, economies of scale, return on investment, as we expand into rural areas with low household density. There's no federal, state, or local authority to require broadband deployment. So there's nothing that compels a carrier to build out into their entire service area. There's lots of carrots out there, like I mentioned with the subsidy funding, but there's no stick approach, if you will, to building out and mandatory build out. The process of installation can be long and cumbersome and definitely inconsistent, I think is probably the most important word there. As we cross the borders of Michigan's 1,856 units of local government and counties, the rules can change. Even when available, service can be out of reach for residents, for issues of cost, digital literacy, and awareness. And of course, our beautiful, gorgeous state has some terrain and vegetation issues when it comes to broadband and expansion. Large bodies of water can impact wireless signals and so on. So that can make, it's a beautiful barrier to broadband expansion. So ways to overcome this, bringing public assets to the table, forming public-private partnerships so that the public entities are bringing something to the table and being more aware of what their options are to participate and get their residents, businesses, and institutions online, creating consistent application, fee, and approval timeline structures for all of our right-of-way jurisdictions in the state so that providers know what to expect when they cross those, again, 1,856 different local government lines, helping to increase demand, overcoming digital literacy barriers, some of the awareness barriers that exist. While we know and want broadband, I know many folks in this room are probably in that boat. We need to fix some of the other issues with awareness and digital literacy to help increase that demand. Lowering capital costs and shortening installation time. The public can help in this by doing some local policy efforts to help with that expansion. Again, encouraging affordability. How do we, if we're not mandating provider build out and we're not mandating that they conform to different cost models, how do we encourage affordability so that everybody can have access to an internet connection? And exploring and encouraging new technologies and new models of deployment that may not have been explored yet, especially in rural areas as we work to solve some of these issues. So the recommendations of the 21st Century Infrastructure Commission follow a lot of this. The first thing that was recommended from the plan was to create the Michigan Consortium on Advanced Networks. Governor Snyder signed an executive order last Monday creating that group. And they're charged with a number of things that relate to all of those different barriers that I mentioned before: policy coordination, asset management, digital literacy, funding options, again, to get broadband out into rural areas. So as that committee, that consortium becomes developed, how will they be tackling those things? Identifying and working to eliminate state and local regulatory barriers, again, is an important way to do this. And again, working to develop public-private partnerships. We have some great examples of where this is already being done in the state. I know that there's representatives from Linden Township here today in Washtenaw County. Linden Township was underserved by broadband, still is, but they're working on it. They brought a number of ISPs to the township to try and figure out how best to expand there, and it just couldn't happen. So they passed a bond in August of last year to construct a fiber network to connect everybody in that township, and then they plan to work with ISPs to offer service on that network. So it's a public-private partnership, breaking down those barriers to infrastructure expansion in a rural community. Clare County, they've been working on public-private partnerships for years now, where they are looking at their rural townships, erecting towers in the rural townships paid for with public dollars. But that means the ISP can then lease space on that tower without having to construct the tower themselves and make that return on investment work in rural places. Harbor Springs, this is a little bit different. This is not an infrastructure work, but it's digital literacy. They recognize that as an issue in their community, not just for residents, but for businesses as well. So they developed their very own digital literacy training program to get more of their businesses online, get their residents online. They have a very successful training program called Wine and Web, where for $25 you get a 6-flight wine tasting and a course in web development. It's sold out every time they do it. I highly recommend it. And in Roscommon and Newaygo counties, they saw this as an economic development issue, so very similar. They wanted to get their businesses online and for them to use the internet to sustain and grow themselves in those counties. So they partnered with Michigan Works and the local economic development corporations to provide, website development, social media development for their local businesses, to get them into a digital economy. So there's lots of things that we can do as a state to help lower these barriers. It's all possible. But I think we need to recognize that it's not just about infrastructure, but we have to address the demand side of the equation as well, so that providers have a way to expand. They can rely on that adoption and that use of that infrastructure, and then those communities can then leverage that infrastructure for improved community and economic development. Thank you.